Today we'll be discussing life on the road for comedians, and we'll be discussing the influence of big pharma on medicine. This is Doctor versus Comedian. I'm Dr. Asif Doja, and this is the Doctor of Laughs.
Not a real doctor.
Ali Hassan. Every episode I pick a topic for Ali from comedy and entertainment and question him about it. Then Ali picks a topic from medicine and health and then grills me on that topic.
Let the grilling begin.
Well, hold on. Today we'll be discussing life on the road for comedians. We'll also be discussing the topic of the influence of the pharmaceutical industry on the prescribing practices of doctors. Ali, I want to talk to you about something serious before we get started. There's this controversy that's been going on recently. I know you and I have talked about it. We've been texting back and forth with some of our friends about it. I really don't know how to address this. I'll just come out and say it. There's a big debate going on when it comes to chicken wings. You get a plate of chicken wings, and there's two types of chicken wings. There's the drums, which look like a mini drumstick, and there's the flats, which have two pieces of bone. And there's a big debate going on about which one is the better option on that plate of wings. And I, of course, thought it was obvious. It's so obvious I didn't even know why it was a debate. It's clearly the drums. And you say
that you're clearly out to lunch. Look, it's clearly the flats, but it's a win-win situation for me. I'm happy. You are disgusted that you know me. That's not how I'm going. I'm like, good. When we go eat chicken wings, you and I compliment each other like peanut butter and jelly all of a sudden, you know? I mean, this is great news. This is what I used to tell people when they were like, why don't you eat pork as a Muslim? I'm like, what do you care? More pork for you, buddy. He won't be in the breakfast sausage line at the buffet at the hotel in front of you. This is a good thing. Celebrate the good.
Listen, I'm just saying, if there's a debate, I don't see why the flats are more... Okay, so because the drum, I think, has more meat on it, and the flat is so difficult to eat. If we're eating together, don't get me wrong, I'll eat the other ones, but if you're saying that there's a binary choice between one or the other, it's clearly the drum. Like, it has more meat.
I'll hear.
And the other one is so hard.
Here's the thing. I would bet that anybody who understands their way around a chicken, for example, a chef or even a cook, a home cook who's well acquainted with making chicken or meat in general, will have no problem. I don't understand what's hard about it, but that's because I've been, cutting chicken since I was a teenager and then doing it professionally for a while. So the way to eat a flat, it's not very difficult. Now, I love the fat of a chicken wing. It's like that crispy fattiness and there's some meat and it's great. And I can eat all the meat off both those bones and I can look at it and be like, that's a job well done. I have accomplished something.
Yeah, you're proud of yourself.
There's been times in my life where I had nothing to be proud of, but I could still be proud of my chicken wing consumption. So there's also more surface area, and I like hot, spicy wings, so there's more of that space that collects all that, Oh, God.
Yeah, that's the argument for the flats, is that there's more surface area, and so you get more of the coating, you get more of the sauce, you get more of the fat, and so that's why people like it. I mean, I just don't, and then some people have this stupid argument. They're like, well, if you wanted drumsticks, why don't you just order a whole bunch of drumsticks? I'm like, yeah, I guess I could. Is that commonly served in restaurants? Actually, I'm saying that, but in British pubs, it actually is commonly served. But as I counter my own argument. And sadly, when we were having this ridiculous conversation via text with our friends, I had to look it up, as did everybody on the text chain, to kind of combat each other's arguments. And on most of the surveys that are done, Ali, do you know who usually wins, drums or flats?
Tell me flats, buddy. Tell me flats.
Unfortunately I think is biased by those professional chicken wing eaters. Like, you got the pros. They don't represent the average person. Okay, listen.
How do I put myself in the shoes of you pedestrian folk? I can't do it. I'm up here, you're down here, you lowly chicken eaters. I can't connect with you.
Exactly. You professionals. So listen, we're talking about some serious things today. We're talking about the stress of life on the road. We're talking about the pharmaceutical industry and its relationship with doctors. But really, this is the issue for this podcast. So please send us your comments, drums or flats.
On a lone, lonesome highway east of Omaha.
That's right. The first music you heard was a cover of Bob Seger's Turn the Page by Metallica. That's from Garage Inc. from 1998. The second music you heard was Ali's cover of Metallica covering Bob Seger.
But could you tell? Could you tell that there was a stop between? Probably not.
So that song is about life on the road, a very famous song by Bob Seger. And so I just thought that would be a good introduction to this topic that I want to ask you about, which is life on the road for a comedian. You know, normally during non-COVID times, you're traveling all the time. And so I was curious about some of this stuff. So why don't we start off with how you started off? So did you start off in comedy kind of just locally and then branching out? How did that work?
So I started in the city of Montreal, where I lived. You know, there's a lesson in this. I'm going to tell a quick story to people. There's a huge lesson in this. There was a place called Jimbo's. It was a pub, and above the pub, Jimbo's, was the Comedy Works, which eventually became sort of my home, my comedy headquarters. I would go there. It was my school. Even if I'm not performing Friday and Saturday, I would almost always be found there watching the headliner from New York or LA or more likely New York or Boston. That's who we got, and Toronto coming in. And I'd watch these performers keep people engaged for 45 minutes, and I'd watch how they do it, and I'd learn. Anyway, I used to do the open mic up there. You just call and you say, hey, could I get on this Monday? It's Ali Hassan. And, you know, sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. It's a night, you know, every city has these. It's an open mic night. There's anywhere from 10 to 14 people on a show. I would get on occasionally. And I remember one night it was canceled. Just not enough people showed up. Like three audience members showed up. And I said to the sound guy, oh, man, Mike's going to be pissed. And Mike was the guy who would call you. You would call a number, and then a guy named Mike would call you back and be like, yeah, you're on. And the sound man goes, why would Mike be pissed? I go, well, it's Mike's club, isn't it? He goes, Mike doesn't own this club. Mike's a booker. I said, who owns this club? And he said, Jimbo. Now, Jimbo, I had no idea owned the club. So what had I been doing? I had been hanging out with Jimbo, drinking with Jimbo. I'd come on a Monday to see maybe I could get on if somebody didn't show up. I'd be singing karaoke with Jimbo, arm in arm. Older man, you know, this dude was in his late 50s. I'm in my 30s.
Mm-hmm. Oh, so not Jimbo Jones from The Simpsons. That's
yes, good way to clear that up. Yeah, he came to life. This is Jimbo, who was like a, you know, like a low rent version of Frank Sinatra. He aspired to be Frank Sinatra, and we would sing Frank Sinatra songs. Now, had I known that he was the club owner, it would have been a very different relationship, right? And it's a great lesson to just be yourself with everybody. And because I was so relaxed and calm, and I'd been singing drunkenly with this man for months before I found out he was a club owner, it really helped me in the club. It really helped me be, you know, now not every club owner likes that. Some club owners are like, no, there should be a divide. You are the employee. But that was a great home for me. And that's when I started. So this was my path. First the open mics, then hosting the open mics. That's work. You're hosting a show with 14 people on it. You're coming back on stage 14 times. You're trying to, if somebody doesn't do well, you have to bring the crowd back up. If somebody really does well and they're high energy and the next comedian is very low energy, you have to be a bridge between that. And you learn that. And sometimes you don't know who these comedians are. And you're like, ooh, that was bad. One guy was like electric energy and the other guy was very monotone on stage. And so, yeah, it's an incredible place to learn comedy. From there, the next step was, let me try to get on open mics in other cities. And Ottawa, your hometown, was the first place I did that. Obvious choice, 2-hour drive. And then it was Toronto. And so people hear about this kind of stuff and they go, wait a minute, so you would drive to Toronto for an open mic? And that is something that's done. I know the guys from Toronto would drive to Ottawa. So we're talking about 4.5 hours just to do a 6-minute set. And that sounds insane, but that's kind of what you do, not just for the stage time, which in itself is super valuable, but to get on the radar of this club, of the owners, of the staff, because, your goal is eventually to headline that club. And so I was able to do that in Quebec and Ontario to a fair degree. And then the next goal is like, how do I travel across Canada? And so there are these organizations that book you, and, you're constantly pitching to them. And then finally there comes a time where they go, okay, we'll have you, and we'll do Medicine Hat, Alberta. Then you'll go to Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, and then you'll go to Regina, Saskatchewan. You'll do maybe 4 shows on a sort of a comedy tour. And that's tough. Those are audiences, this country, Canada, is not a monolith. Audiences are different. People are different. They have different things. So if your jokes are very local or regional and you head out to another part of the country, it's a real trial by fire situation. So you don't think about that when you start, because you're like, hey, I live in La Salle, Quebec. I'm going to have 10 minutes on La Salle, Quebec. Huge mistake.
So a couple follow-up questions about that. The first is, people are probably wondering, well, how do you go from open mics to getting booked? Like, is it just making phone calls and stuff like that? Like, how does that work?
Here's a tip I have for people who might be listening who are aspiring performers. You do your best every single time you're on stage. That should be a common, that should be common sense, but it isn't for everybody. It's always be ready to do your best, and don't be negative, right? That's somebody that nobody wants around. That's immediately like, oh, this night sucks. There's only 5 people here. That level of like negativity and entitlement, nobody wants that around. So if you are a good person to be around and you always get the job done, you can now approach a club owner and say, I'd like to do weekends. Now, when you do approach that club owner, my experience has been the worst thing you can possibly do, which many people do, is I'm ready to do weekends. When are you going to have me on weekends? I'm ready. Because every club owner is like, I've been in this business for many years. Why don't you let me tell you when you're ready, you piece of trash? Stop telling me that you're right. So in my experience with a number of club owners, it's always been, my goal is this. I'd love to achieve that goal. Can you tell me what I need to get there? That's always been a better way in my experience. And, if you look at my career, I think, it speaks for itself that I didn't have, there's some club owners that'll never have you on, right? In the city of Winnipeg, there's a club owner that just, this is not what he looks at. And you have to be willing to accept that as well. You have to be willing that this particular person, some of them even reply to your email. They're like, hey, yeah, listen, man, I'm keeping my eye on you and I'll get back to you. And then that's sort of the end of it. You follow up and nothing. Some never respond. They have their, it's no different from, let's say, the Judd Apatows of the world. We've spoken about this on the show. Judd knows Seth Rogen. Judd knows, let's say, Aziz Ansari. Judd knows this person. People go with what they know. Are they going to take a chance on this other guy, coming from here? That maybe not. But that's the way to do it. So I went from an open mic to, would I be able to open on the weekends, right? Now that's a graduation. That's a really big transition, because open mic, people's expectations are super low anyway. As I said, it's sometimes 14 people on the show. You're running around. But if you can show some semblance of control in that environment, you can be looked at to do an opening spot on the weekends, meaning on the Thursday show, you do 5 minutes after the host. So you typically have the host start the show, bring on a special guest or a guest act or opening act. That's you. You do 5 to 7. Then there's a middle act who does 20 to 25. And then there's the headliner who does 45. That's typically the format. So to do that opening spot, usually you should have been doing pretty well on open mics. And once you do opening at weekends in one city, you can sort of pitch yourself to other cities and other clubs. Hey, I'm an opener. I'd love to open at your club.
So then, getting back to what you were saying before, now that you're pitching to other cities, but then you said you kind of dealt with a booker who so would a booker book you, say, in like the prairies of Canada. So you would go to like Saskatoon, Medicine Hat, and do Regina and do like a loop there. Would they take care of that? Or you're putting it all together? You're like, okay, I'm going to pitch myself to this city and then this city, then this city, then this city. So you could, I guess,
Yeah, I
you
mean,
fly out
both
there and then
options.
you drive around or rent a car. How does this all work?
Yeah, I mean, both options exist. I went with a booking company and a booker. So that's somebody who you'll never see them at these clubs. They may not even be in any of the cities that you do on a 5-city tour, but that's just relationships that they have with clubs. And they say, we have this person. What do you think? We'll book for this weekend, this weekend. And they have a whole calendar of just booking comedians. That's what they do. Other people, much more resourceful than I was, will do their own tour. They get 3 comedians together and then they drive. They drive a car into the ground. They put on hundreds of hours in a car and tens of thousands of kilometers in bars and pubs. And there's a risk there. There's a risk that you get there and like, oh, you don't have a stage? Oh, you don't have a microphone. That's interesting. I assumed when I said I was going to do comedy, you thought. So you get to these cities sometimes on like a 12 to 20 city tour and you learn a lot about, I didn't book this properly. I don't have the experience to have done it. And this club just saw an opportunity to make some money and they don't care about comedy at all. That happens too. But you really, as I say, you really cut your teeth in environments like that, all these different cities in one tour and getting to know that life because it's not for everybody.
Yeah, and so I guess this is what we're talking about, is this going from one place to another, like, and I guess it's just these logistics that I keep wondering about. So as you talked about, like, where do you stay when you go on these booked tours? Are things paid for? So is your hotel paid for? Is your transportation paid for? Your meals paid for? Are you doing it all out of pocket? And what is you don't have to tell me exactly how much money you made on these tours, but like, are you actually making money, or is this like a money losing, or is it break even just to get exposure?
Some people make money. A guy like myself who was so incredibly bad with money wasn't making a ton of money.
Elaborate.
Well, I think me, like, yes, your accommodations are almost always paid for. Some comedy clubs have a condo or an apartment, which they rent for the headliner and the middler. If you're an opener, you're just coming through.
Yeah, spotlessly clean. I'm assuming those ones must be just.
Oh God, yeah, no, they're not. They're not for everybody. I used to bring my own pillowcase sometimes just to make sure I didn't have to. Yeah, but it's no different from a hotel in that sense, right? They have people every Monday or Tuesday cleaning up the place. Usually, it's a comedian or somebody who works at the bar staff.
Oh, those people clean they get paid to clean the condo.
Exactly.
Okay, right.
Exactly, and you're like, oh, that person doesn't even wash their hands after making 10 drinks. That's the person that cleaned the con. You do a little bit of math. You're like, the condo's probably not that clean. That part is accommodations are typically almost always paid for when you are middler or host. So let's maybe not even middler, a host or a headliner for sure.
Okay.
What's not paid for is the food, which is where things go awry for me personally, because some comedians could survive on one meal a day, and that meal being the chicken fingers and fries or the, whatever, lasagna or whatever the club serves, right?
So you get a free meal there, or?
Yeah, now not all clubs have that. The ones that do will give the comedians a free meal. And so some of these guys, it's like a part of the passion. It's part of the challenge of comedy. How little can I spend? I was raised by a spendthrift father. It's like he never left the house without coming back home with something. Look, I picked up some bagels. I picked up some fries. I picked up something. And it was like there was a joy in that as his son. And still to this day, if I leave with my kids, they know they're going to get something on the way. We're going to pick up something. And every time we come home, my mother goes, was that necessary? My wife. Wow, that's a weird slip. Okay. My wife, like my mother.
That's going to be another show in a couple of weeks, I think.
That's a medical condition that needs to be examined thoroughly. But yeah, so I want to eat breakfast, and I want to eat a good breakfast. And sometimes it's at a diner, but sometimes it's at the hot, new, cool place in town that these hipsters just opened up. And then I want to eat lunch. I'm not going to wait till dinner for lasagna. And typically, I wouldn't even Like if I was doing a whole week at a club, let's say like Tuesday to Sunday, I come in strong. I come in like I'm going to save money. I'm going to go back with money. This is stupid. I need to make money. And so I'd eat the lasagna at the club on a Tuesday, and then I'd never eat at the club again. I'd be like, I tried. But yeah, there are ways to save money, but that really depends on your own personality. The joy of this is really the hanging out with other comedians, right? That's the joy. But also, you're paired with a headliner. Sometimes that's not the best, you know? And I feel so blessed to have been paired with such great people. But I know I know my friend Steph, I'll tell you, Steph Tola, fantastic comedian who's in LA now. She was paired with somebody who was an older dude who smoked a lot. And she said every morning for 45 minutes, she thought he was going to die. And she'd have to lie in bed going like, hey, what do I do? Because he'd be in the bathroom just coughing up a lung.
Right.
And that was his morning routine. And I know that routine because that was my father's routine. So that's horrible that somebody has to go through that. Another guy I know had money stolen from him from, the person who was headlining, who was sharing the condo. Another person, my friend Iman.
Jerry Seinfeld is a real jerk for that.
Jerry. It wasn't Jerry. Jerry. Wash Jerry's name out of your mouth.
That's why he's a billionaire.
Stealing money from people's socks. And then my friend Iman, who you know very well, Asif.
Great comment.
Iman was once paired up with a headliner. This is an American touring headliner. That's his career. He recently started dating a girl. I guess she was somewhere in the northern U.S. and he's from Texas, and he's in Ottawa, sharing a condo with our friend Iman. And his girlfriend gets incredibly jealous that he is sharing a condo, even though you're not in bunk beds in the same room. You have your own separate rooms, and then there's a common room. But she was so insanely jealous that Iman never saw him once. He was not allowed by his girlfriend to socialize, and he had to go and just shut his door and talk to her, and he would have to talk to her until he fell asleep. So he was in like this weird relationship. And so, yeah, it's not always fun, but I've been very happy I'm very blessed to have some great times. That said, I knew that when I was doing these gigs, in like Medicine Hat and these casinos and stuff, I was like, this is not what I want. I always wanted to move up to theaters. So even small theater, even a 250-seat theater, it brings in a different quality of people. You don't have to have the bouncers coming over and being like, miss, sir, you have to keep your voice down. Why? We paid money for these beers. You don't have to deal with that kind of stuff. You don't have to deal with hecklers. You don't have to I love doing comedy. And I loved entertaining people, and I didn't want to be a babysitter of drunkards, So I always wanted to move up from there. So for me, it was a stepping stone. I think that's important. Some people are like, this is what I always wanted, to tour all the time. And I think they find that tougher when they're dealing with unruly audiences.
Right. So you brought up a couple interesting points. One is this life on the road. Don't you think that there got to be people who just love this? Like, I'm not saying you do necessarily, but there's got to be people who love this. Town to town, just going. You hear this a lot with some professional athletes, mainly, I would say, performers, like we talked about Bob Seger, Metallica. Some of these guys, they just love the road. They get antsy when they're at home and they can't really deal with that. They want every night partying and going to a new place, and then they sleep in, get up, do the next thing, and then just keep like lather, rinse, repeat, And have you met a lot of people like that? Like, this is their life. They love this, being on the road.
Yeah, it's a little bit different for comedians. I can't imagine enjoying that, you're on a 90-day tour and you're like, what city are we in again? Like that, that musicians will go through that. I think that's that's much more infrequent with comedians. It's much more infrequent. There are the Russell Peters of the world, or Sugar Sammys of the world that leave for like maybe a month, 2 months. But I actually love the road. I love it. I love it because it's only maybe at most 2 weeks, and then I'm back home. And after I leave and come back, my wife's always like, you're always a better father after you've been away. And I'm like, yeah, you know what? I agree.
And you were the best father when you weren't there. That was actually that was the best.
Yeah, well, she literally has said, we benefit from your departure and you benefit from your departure. So whatever that says about my parenting skills, let it be.
The other thing that you brought up, which I want to ask about, is these places that you've played at. So you were talking about bigger theaters and things like that. So let's maybe talk about some of the bigger venues and maybe some of the, like, what's the most far out place that you've gone, whether it's out of North America or where have you been?
I performed in Edinburgh.
Okay.
That was a bit of a nightmare for a variety of reasons. The Edinburgh Comedy Festival, you just never knew from day to day, will it be 4 people showing up? Will it be a full room, full being 30? It was a small room. But, every day they'd be, oh, yeah, you only had 4 people because it was raining last night. You'll be great tomorrow. You'll be great tomorrow.
I'm not sure why raining would, like, it's indoors, wasn't it?
I know. Well, people just aren't leaving their house or their apartment.
Okay, yeah.
Next day, sunny, beautiful day, 2 people show up. And then they're like, it was terrible everywhere. It was terrible everywhere. Next day, full house, 30 people. I'm like, I made it. I'm amazing. Next day, 7 people. You're like, oh, maybe the 30 didn't like it, and they told everybody. This is an emotional roller coaster that was awful. But I love being in Edinburgh. I love some of the people I met. I love the late night socializing that I was doing. I really like that. In Canada, I would say the place I like the most, I do like the West Coast quite a bit. Mm-hmm. I really like the West Coast. And my favorite is like the Okanagan area and Kelowna, Penticton. If you've ever been to these areas, is a great along the Okanagan River. And then also in BC in the interior is a place called Nelson. And Nelson was just a wonderful theater. They were great people. They came out on a long weekend. I didn't know anybody there. And then there was like 6 people I went and hung out with afterwards. We had some drinks.
From the audience?
Stayed in touch with them from the audience. Yeah. So it's like the ideal situation. So other people maybe went to Nelson and got punched in the face immediately and then mugged. I had the opposite experience and I had a great time. I got a standing ovation. You can't take that away from me. That's always going to be Nelson for me. So I really like that whole area. That's my favorite place to travel to. 2022, baby!
There you go. So Nelson, BC sounds very exotic, but didn't you tell me you went to the Middle East once to do comedy?
The Middle East of Canada?
The Middle East of the world.
I did go to the Middle East. I can't believe... Oh, my memory's failing me. That was the best.
This is a big shout out to Nelson, BC. You liked it more than traveling internationally.
I mean, I loved it in Canada. You know what? Amman, Jordan, I went twice.
Twice, yeah.
And that was the best. That was the best. Both times, I mean, I was also new in comedy. I was only 2, 3, 4 years in, and I went to this Amman Comedy Festival, and the way we were treated and the joy. This is the key. This is why comedy right now, there's actually this fun thing happening. Comedians are anxious to perform. Audience members are loving it. They're so anxious to hear live comedy. That's the way it was in the Middle East. It's like, there's cities in every country. When the big tours go, whoever it is, whether it be music or comedy, whoever, people don't usually come to their city. So when people do come to their city, Tom Power is a friend of mine. He's host of a show called Q on CBC Radio. He said anytime somebody comes to St. John's, they're so happy because St. John's, Newfoundland, that's costly, right? If you're a band, 5 people, roadies, whatever, that costs a whole lot. You're adding a whole lot more.
Sorry, people who don't know, Newfoundland is an island, so it's not easy to get to. You need to either fly in or take a ferry. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So when people come, they appreciate it. And I felt like the Middle East was like that. Back then, especially, it was like this sort of the Wild West of comedy. It was just starting. People only knew it from the internet, but they knew it very well. They were just so appreciative. Both the bookers, the promoters, the audience members, and the comics were so happy to be out there. It was a real time capsule.
I think if I recall, you were going, it was around the Arab Spring time as well. Not springtime, but the Arab Spring, that kind of change in the Middle East at that time. I think it was around then. It
was just before that. It was 2008 and 2009 that I went. Yeah. It was a great time.
Maybe you going incited the Arab Spring. I think probably.
I think you can lock and print that. All right, Asif, this is something that has plagued me and others. Some of us, maybe it hasn't plagued, it's maybe just intrigued us. For me personally, the influence of pharma on doctors themselves. This is not about big pharma and medicine and the larger, broader conversation. We will have one of those episodes as well. This is really in doctors' lives. I really want to know about that because I remember, I thought you get a pen, right? You get a nice Merck Frost or Pfizer pen, and that's how they stay top of mind. I had a friend, dermatologist, who was brought to Whistler, British Columbia on a ski trip by a pharma company. Like, I know wining and dining, but he was flown from East Coast to West Coast and stayed in Whistler and skied. And that was how this pharma company, that's better than a pen. That's better than a pen, unless you don't ski, unless you could kill yourself on a ski hill. That's good. But it really, that's where I'm coming from with this questioning. Why do they do it? Is it fair that they do it? Should they do it? Let's cover that whole thing. And what has been your experience in this? Obviously, you would not be immune to doctors. Pharma reps coming in and whining and dining and flirting and titillating you.
Wow, there's a lot of stuff to unpack there. So let's just start at the beginning. So let's just start with my experience, okay? So when I started medical school, there were a lot of rules that were not in place then that are in place now. Pharmaceutical influence on students and doctors. So we'll talk about how those rules came in place over time. But when I was in medical school, you'd get like a bag, like a free doctor's bag with a bunch of different like logos on it, Not like a terribly nice bag, like a canvas bag you get maybe if you attended a conference or something like that, but you get those at school. And then I remember we got a free textbook. I'm like, oh, okay. So I actually went and pulled out this textbook. I'm like, do I still have this? So I found it. It's First Principles of Gastroenterology. Okay. So
one of my favorites.
That's right. You read this every night, do you? You have a copy?
Yeah, read it to the kids a couple of times.
And you say, oh, that's great. It's sponsored by the Canadian Association of Gastroenterology. Awesome. So I got a free textbook. This is like, 600 pages of a textbook. Well, that was great. I remember very distinctly getting it for free. Don't think I've opened it because I'm not a gastroenterologist.
But let me ask you this. Where on that book does it say that pharmaceutical company's name?
It says it on the first page.
Okay, when you open it, it's kind of stamped in there.
Underneath Canadian Association of Gastroenterology, it says Astra Pharma Inc. So we would get these types of things all the time.
And does it say courtesy of or from your friends at, or it just says their name, that's it?
It says sponsored by the Canadian Association of Gastroenterology and Astra Pharma Inc.
Got it.
Okay.
So it's subtle. It's subtle.
Yeah, it's not a big, huge stamp on it or anything like that. So, you kind of get these things. And then I remember when we stopped doing our in-class stuff and we do our rotations, which is called clerkship in medicine. When we did our internal medicine service, which is when you rotate through all the subspecialties in adult internal medicine, every day there'd be a lunch. There'd be a talk and a lunch and a hot lunch every day. And so, everybody would rush to finish what they were doing in the morning so they could attend this hot lunch. And every day it was sponsored by a different drug company. Now, and maybe this is me defending myself in that, but I didn't know who the drug companies were and what products they made. Like, I really had no idea.
You just wanted your hot lunch.
But some people would argue that's actually the point, right? This subtle influence of pharma. They're just there. Oh, they're not really, hammering things in your face about their drug, but they're there. They're all there. They're sitting in the back during the lectures. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Then in residency, again, remember in medical school, like a free lunch, as you said, like we have no money, like we're in debt, like that's pretty good. Then in residency again, I'm making some money, but still I was living in Toronto, still had debt to pay and things like that. There would be drug dinners sometimes. So drug sponsored dinners where they'd have a speaker. You'd go to the talk and you have a really nice meal.
And these are specifically for residents or also for practicing doctors?
Mainly for practicing doctors, but they're like, well, residents can come if they want.
Okay.
And these were the rules back then. Okay, they have changed over time. So I would go, and it was some of the best restaurants in Toronto. That's how I tried most of the top restaurants in Toronto, by going to these drug dinners, and they move around and do a different one. I would say there's probably every month or so we would go to something like that. And then I remember once I was at a conference, and one of the drug reps, I don't know how I ended up talking to them. They invited me out to a dinner, and it was at one of those high-end steakhouses, like a Ruth Chris or Morton's, you know?
Yeah,
And it
sure.
was just me, the drug rep, and like 3 doctors, okay? And I could just tell when I was there, like these are practicing doctors, and I'm just a resident in pediatric neurology, like I'm a nobody. And these weren't people who were working in an academic center; they were working in the community, right? So there may have been a bit more interaction with drug reps, and like, just to give an example, they're like, "Yeah, let's just order a lobster or 2 for the table. How about that?" Lobsters were $100 a pop at
Right.
this steakhouse. So let's just order that for the table. Like, just extravagant amounts of money. So then, as time went on, I was like, and then you go to these conferences, and at a conference, a medical conference, there's these booths that are set up. Okay. And they have different things at the booths. And sometimes when you're a resident, you'd be like, I'm going to see how many pens I can get from different places. And booths give little things. So sometimes they give like little models of the brain, which I can use in my clinic, or they give pens, or they give like, often, sometimes they're giving out ice cream, like free ice cream or frozen yogurt or something. Like, well, of course I'm going to go get that. They'll just do anything. And then, but I always felt gross. I didn't want to talk to them. So I tried to like go take a pen when like nobody was looking, when they were occupied talking to somebody else, because then they want to talk about their drug, and I'm not that interested in talking to them about it.
Hey, is your booth on fire? Do you smell smoke? And then you quickly get an ice cream and run away.
That's right. As time went on, and also I don't need free ice cream. As I started to practicing and things like that, I now was making more money, and I've been paying off my debts, and I'm like, I don't really need this. I can go to a nice restaurant, and I don't need to have to sit through this talk in a drug rep. And there are definitely physicians who are known as being in bed with the drug companies and drug reps. Like, we all know who they are, our colleagues. Very few of them work at my hospital or at an academic center, and I'll explain why that doesn't happen anymore. So very rarely associated with universities in that way. But I definitely know a lot of people who, like, the drug companies, again, pay for their trips and things like that. This all goes back to your bigger question, like, why would they do this? And we're talking billions of dollars a year is often spent on marketing. So the marketing budget from companies is, some studies say, $5 to $8 billion a year in North America. And part of the marketing is this marketing specifically to doctors and these drug reps coming in. And why do they do it? Because it works. There's no other reason why you'd spend that kind of money.
Now, these doctors who you said you know them, right? Everybody knows of them. They have a reputation for being in bed with pharma. Do they do this with the justification that, well, it's available, so why not? And it's free, and it's not like they're influencing me anyway? Is that what they would say?
Yeah. Okay. So that's a good point. I don't really know. Maybe some of them are like, why wouldn't I take free stuff and a free trip? Maybe for myself and my family. I don't know. And I'll talk about some of the rules that are in place in a second. But people don't think this works on them. They think I'm too smart for this. And again, I'll feign my ignorance. I remember when I was a resident medical student, I didn't know which drug company made which drugs. So if I was going to a dinner, I'd be like, oh, that's a great dinner that we're at. But I didn't really correlate it with this company makes this drug. But I think, over time, now I do know that. And certainly a practicing physician who's been there for a couple of years knows which drug rep is peddling which drug. So there's some evidence for doctors not thinking it works on them. There was one study from JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, in 2007. They talked to departmental chairs. Okay, so this is the heads of departments in medicine, and more than 2/3 of them thought that having a relationship with industry or pharma would have no effect on their professional activities. And there's another study from a few years before that in the American Journal of Medicine where they surveyed residents like myself at the time. And then they said residents generally hold positive attitudes towards gifts from industry and think they're not influenced by them.
And no kidding, you would think it's positive. I just told you a story about how comedians are not eating until they get their free dinner.
Right.
chicken fingers at a club. You guys are getting lobster for the table? No kidding, you'd have a positive feeling about it.
But doctors have this fallacy all the time. This is a slight aside, but doctors also think they think for some reason, to be blunt, that they're better than everybody else. And then they're like, well, this would work on somebody else, but I'm smart. This won't work on me.
I know. Well, that's what we all have to deal with as friends and family of you, Asif, right?
Exactly.
That arrogance is
part
and parcel of
doctors are also terrible with financial matters, but they think because I'm smart and I'm a smart doctor that I'm smart at finance. You're not smart with this. Like, don't pretend you are, because the majority of you are not. You can't all be good
Shots
at that.
fired. Shots fired at his colleagues.
Shots fired at every other doctor, including myself. Let's talk about some of the scientific evidence for this amount of pharmaceutical influence on doctors and whether it works or not. So ProPublica, this website, news organization ProPublica, they studied the 50 most prescribed name brand drugs in Medicare. And this is for things like diabetes, glaucoma, hypertension, so common diseases. On average, doctors who received payments from drug companies prescribed 58% more of a drug than doctors who did not. And the payments could include money for delivering a talk, consulting fees, sponsored meals, sponsored travel. And in the US, these things are more tightly regulated in that they must be disclosed more than in Canada. So that's why ProPublica was able to get some of this data. So also Global News, which is a news organization in Canada, they did a really good series a couple years ago, which looked at this same issue in Canada. So they found out that between 2017 and 2018, the 10 largest pharmaceutical companies in Canada gave more than $151 million to both doctors and hospitals across the country. And remember, like I said, the US has legislation that you need to disclose this, as do many European countries, but Canada does not.
So you don't need to limit it, but you need to disclose it. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. In the U.S., it's the Physician Payment Sunshine Act, which is any doctor who receives any transfer of value, so gifts or cash.
Aforementioned trip with the family, that kind of stuff, you have to say.
Yeah. Exceeding $10 must be disclosed by law. And then that information is publicly available. So if you looked at that, in 2018, $9.35 billion was paid to physicians and teaching hospitals in the U.S. So huge amounts. But in terms of whether it works or not, a couple studies. Another study from the journal The American Medical Association from 2016, and I'll just call that JAMA because there's a couple JAMA articles we'll be talking about. They found that industry-sponsored meals of less than $20, this is a bag lunch at a conference, were associated with an increased rate of prescribing the name brand medication that was being promoted as part of that. 20, this is nothing, but you
see that, doctors? Huh? Doctors, you think it wouldn't work on you, huh?
Exactly. Another study published in 2018 shows that U.S. counties that had doctors receiving more payments from drug companies that made opioids had higher overdose death rates. Okay, and that's probably a whole other conversation about the opioid crisis and and how the pharmaceutical companies have been implicated in that. Another study from JAMA also looked at faculties of medicine, and when they put restrictions on drug reps, they found that more generics were described. So just to recap, when a drug comes out, it's a name brand drug for several years, and then eventually it's allowed to be made by generic companies. Generic brands cost less money to the consumer, so to the patients, right? You and I. You and me. I take medication too. So too much information. So generics cost less money to the system, right? In the U.S. to Medicare, Medicaid, and in Canada to our provincial health systems. So putting these restrictions helps. And then again, there was a systematic review that was done, and it found that essentially, they basically found that giving these gifts affects prescribing behavior and contributes to irrational prescribing of the company's drug, when a generic would be cheaper, even when another drug would be better. So it's pretty clear that this occurs, and it does influence the behavior of doctors.
Well, this is also interesting to me because, I had, I used to have a girlfriend. I lived with a woman who was a doctor. One of my, childhood buddies is you. Another childhood buddy is a dermatologist. I've been around doctors for a long time. It's pretty unanimous. You all find drug reps a little bit of a nuisance. Right. And I also know a couple of drug reps. One who was like, she was willing to drive off a cliff every day. She hated her job so much because she hated being so intrusive and treated like a nuisance. So where inside all that, again, anecdotal, not evidence. I'm just going by what I know. Some drug reps, some doctors, drug reps who hated being drug reps, doctors who didn't particularly care for the drug reps to come, and yet still, how does all these free samples get through, and how do all these?
Yeah, so these are all good questions, and I'm going to try and do this without maligning a whole industry of people. But again, I have a friend, similar story to you, who was a drug rep, and she is such a nice person. She just couldn't behave in some of these behaviors that or she couldn't engage in some of these behaviors that she just thought were kind of slimy, and she was one of the lowest in terms of performing people. So it's a tough game for sure. So, but what do doctors think about it? Most doctors see drug reps. A 2009 survey from Prism Healthcare sent only 7% of doctors do not see drug reps, so 93% do.
Oh.
Of the people who see them, 88% say they see them for information, and 85% say they see them for the samples. So let's just talk about the samples, because you brought that up. The samples are an interesting marketing tactic because, again, and we don't, at my hospital, we don't receive samples from drug reps. That's just a blanket statement.
That's a policy?
Because it's a very subtle marketing tactic, right? It's a gift. You think you're doing something for the patient. It's like, oh, I can get them this free drug. Like, that's good. The family doesn't have to pay for it. But eventually the free samples run out. Some drug companies I deal with do have compassionate coverage, and they do supply expensive drugs for some of my patients for free. This is very, very nice of them, and I do appreciate that. So again, they're not all evil or things like that. They do have a lot of these programs which help out a lot. So, but what do you do once you've been on it for a while, right? The free sample medication, now it's expensive because you've run out of your free samples, then you have to buy it, right? And
this is proper drug dealer. This is drug dealer behavior, right? First you entice them with a little free sample, then they have to come to you to buy. I see. And
drug companies, they know exactly. They have databases that know who is prescribing what. All the drug companies know what I prescribe in my area, is in my geographic area.
Wow.
They know all my prescribing habits. And that's why, and so eventually some of them, not a lot of them have, but they've been subtly sometimes told me, yeah, I notice you don't prescribe a lot of this. Why is that? And can we talk about this? Those are pretty bad drug reps.
Oh, you gotta love that. You gotta love that.
This is my, so I have very little interaction with drug reps these days, and it's because of some of the changes that have gone on. So my university, and by extension my hospital, have very strict rules, and these have come into place in most universities for the past 5 or 10 years. So you cannot accept any gifts from pharmaceutical companies. So as little as a pen, as much as like your free trip or my lobster dinner. You cannot accept those. What you can do is I can attend a talk that's sponsored by a drug company, that's fine, and say it's at a restaurant, but I have to pay for my own meal. The only person who can get their meal paid for is the physician who is giving the talk, because they're giving a talk and getting something in exchange for their time, which is fine. So I wasn't really going to a lot of these talks anyway, but now we definitely, I definitely don't. The drug reps...
No more free ice cream for you.
The drug reps also can't just show up to our clinic and be like, oh, okay, hey, I'm here. Can I just talk to you about this? They can't do that anymore. That's prohibited here.
Just to be clear, they can do that at clinics worldwide, but your particular clinic and your hospital
and my anything associated with my university. So that's right. So these drop-ins with like a plate of muffins, or donuts or something, just I come by and drop these off for your clinic staff. Those still happen in the community, but they do not happen in my university and my hospital.
If it happens to you, you just take your arm and you just shove all of the donuts on the ground and go take that. And you kick them? No,
I don't. But if they show up to clinic, I'm like, you can't do this. You need to leave. Like these are the rules, and these are the rules that. And to be honest with you, I agree with these rules. I don't think they should be doing it. So sometimes they do. One of the things that they can sometimes give is what are called unrestricted educational grants. So in other words, if we have a training program, if we're offering a course, you can say, okay, well, how about you give us some money to help support the course? Okay. But, and we may include the logo saying sponsored by, but that's the most that will happen. And you're allowed to do that, but you need to disclose that. If it's, especially if it's a university run course, you need to disclose this. And they can have zero input on the content of the course. Okay, so often I'll say like, okay, well, we want to have this training program, we want to do this course. Will you give us an unrestricted educational grant? And the last time I asked one of these drug reps, because I scheduled a meeting with him, allowed to schedule a meeting, come into my office. This guy was sweating, by the way, like a Rodney Dangerfield or Chris Farley. It was like craziness. I'm like, am I that intimidating? He's like, yeah, I just want to share you some of the information on our drugs. I'm like, hold it right there. I know how to read scientific literature. I know about different drugs I prescribe. You don't need to walk me through anything with your bias. And I don't want to hear this. I know your drug exists. I'll read the research and I'll decide whether I want to prescribe it or not. You don't have to tell me anything. But I said,
you with your BSc in biology. I'm a doctor, for God's sake.
Oh, you mean him with his BSc in biology? Yeah.
Yes, yeah. I was doing you. I was doing you talking to him.
So yeah. I really have no time for that. But I'm like, if you want to give us an unrestricted educational grant for our training program, that'd be fine. He's like, well, yeah, I can't really do that. But if you want me to do a drug dinner, a drug sponsored dinner where we can have, I'm like, just stop talking. Like, I'm not interested in this.
Stop talking, but keep sweating. I'm enjoying that.
So
I wonder what that was
so
about.
And we know that these restrictions do work, right, in terms of this. I mean, that's basically my interactions these days with drug reps. Very minimal. I don't think, most of them don't like me because I'm pretty strict with these rules, and so they don't email me. They may email my colleagues, but they don't really email me or bother me that much.
Okay, so my final question on this, and I know it was going to be very specific to you, but I wanted to know your feelings on this because as a lay person, a person of the lay that I am, also with a university education, and I've been on, there's 2 university campuses I've been to.
You mean like in your life? You mean like you've attended 2 universities?
No, I've attended 2 universities. You do see for example, the GlaxoSmithKline building, the Merck Frost building, the whatever. You see buildings on university campuses. That is hundreds of millions of dollars spent to erect a building on a university campus. A, that's not done for their health. That is done with something in mind. I want to know what that something is. And B, why is that allowed? I mean, I'm sure in the position of the university, you're like, oh, they're going to give us this much money and we can get a new science building. Great. But it's like, you're turning away free samples. This is like for 4 years, you are going to the Pfizer building. Every morning, your classes are in the Pfizer building, and it's in your head as a aspiring doctor or scientist. I mean, that's incredible marketing, but it feels unethical to me.
Right. So, I mean, and that certainly has happened in the past. I think universities are trying to accept that money less frequently, especially for things like that. But, the pharmaceutical companies, they want, obviously, as you're saying, I mean, there's reasons why they would spend millions of dollars with these donations to universities in North America. It's because they want this idea that interaction with these companies should be the norm, right? Like, and then subconsciously, as you're saying, like they want to influence future doctors and their prescribing practices. And part of it is like what we were saying about the textbook that I got. Those things are not allowed anymore, by the way. We'll link to this Global News article. They actually have a 4-part series about this issue. It's very well done. They interviewed somebody from the University of Toronto back around when I was in Toronto in the early 2000s, and they got they did a week-long course on pain management, and it was sponsored by Purdue Pharma. And Purdue Pharma currently has a class action lawsuit against it for opioids. Yeah. So because they make OxyContin. And so, I mean, that kind of bias. So I think universities are moving away from that. I'll give you some examples because this is still kind of occurring. University of Montreal received in 2017 and 2018 about almost $500,000 for various health science projects from Pharma. Queen's University, $700,000 or so. In 2013, McGill's Faculty of Medicine received $4 million from Merck. So these things are still happening, but a lot of the companies are switching and they're donating this money for research. Okay, so this is a bit more complicated. Research money is hard to come by, as anybody who does research knows, especially for bigger trials and things like that. It's hard to come by, and so now, instead of the money being necessarily given for buildings or for, but there sometimes is for research buildings or for free trips and stuff like that, they're like, well, we're going to give money to you guys for research. So for example, the University of Toronto itself, just one university in Canada, the biggest university, Apotex, which is a generic manufacturer, donated between 1995 and 2004 $2.8 million. GlaxoSmithKline from 94 to 2020, $4.5 million. Janssen from 2014 to 2019, $1.6 million, and it goes on and on. So these are donations for research. So I think a lot of times the universities are like, well, it's for research, though. It's not, for physical things.
And that research can be on anything.
Well,
it's completely
I don't know,
disconnected
because a lot of these
okay.
things are not publicly available. So it becomes very difficult. To be fair, I mean, I'm going to be very honest with you. I collaborated on a study. I've collaborated on drug studies before for sure, but I collaborated on one from Shire, Canada. They made like some ADHD medications, and our project was related tangentially to ADHD, and they gave us a considerable sum of money and for that. And so when you personally receive money like that for a research project, obviously it just goes to the research. You don't get any money from that per se for a salary or anything like that, but you need to disclose that. So that's the other thing that we do in medicine, is we disclose these things that I've received. So like, I've received money from Pharma for research. I can't speak to what the strings attached to some of these donations are for research, if there's any, if they're what we call these unrestricted grants, and maybe there's a combination, maybe some are unrestricted, maybe some aren't, but certainly there is still this influence of pharma on medical schools. It's just now switched more to this research capacity.
Now, final question here, Asif. You cannot be anti-pharma as a doctor. That's impossible. But I know you do have some issues with pharma and some of the policies. Where do you stand in general on this?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really like a lot of their marketing, and that's where I have the issue. So kind of the topic that we talked about today. But is pharma useful? It 100% is useful. They spend millions, well, actually they spend billions of dollars in research and developments for new drugs, and these new drugs help my patients. And I'll give you the example, as we've talked about before, I see a lot of patients with epilepsy. So there's a lot of new epilepsy drugs that come out. And I'm very keen on these drugs when they come out. The reason being is because our older epilepsy drugs, they work, but they have a lot of side effects. And those drugs which came out 30, 40, 50 years ago, if you tried to have them come out now, they would never pass muster. They're like, these have way too many side effects. They would not be approved by the FDA. They would not be approved by Health Canada. Nobody would buy this medication. There's no way. But we have those drugs historically. All their R&D goes into refining those old drugs to make them more tolerable, more safer, less side effects, or developing new drugs that have less side effects. And by far, the new medications that come out have less side effects than the old ones, because there's no way they could get to market if they had the same side effects as they did before. So that's good for my patients, because they're pushing things forward to try and develop these drugs, again, more efficacious, more tolerable, less side effects. That's a good thing. So I do appreciate what they do in that respect. And if they didn't, I'd have less and less to offer the patients that I see. So I think we need pharmaceutical companies to be doing this. Obviously, and again, we could talk about this in a future episode, but they need to recoup their costs, right? From all the R&D. And what about all the failed drugs that never make it to market, that in phase 1 and 2 trials fails out, or in lab studies fails out? They invested all this money. So when they finally get their drug that comes to market, they need to try and make money from that. And so I understand that. I understand that need. I commend them for doing that, for pushing things forward. But on the other hand, it's just the way they market it sometimes I have some problems with.
And I'm sure they have some problems with you as well.
So that's our show for today. Ali, anything to plug?
No, I think standupali.com is a place you can go, and I'll things that are coming up, I'll put news up there. I'll put news about any, if some of these auditions I'm doing go well and turn into something, I'll let people know what's happening. Yeah.
Definitely.
There's a few things coming down the pipeline, but nothing confirmed. So standupali.com is the best place to go. And I'll have I'll share good news here and there as it comes my way. But definitely something to plug right now immediately is this website. We have a listener base that continues to grow, and we really appreciate it. We thank you for spreading the word. If you can spread the word to just 2 people about this podcast, if you think they would be fans and there's information in here that they would enjoy, we would really appreciate that.
Absolutely. drvcomedian@gmail.com if you want to reach out to us, or on social media, Dr. V Comedian on Twitter, on Instagram. We're everywhere. Facebook, LinkedIn. You can find us just about everywhere. And please reach out to us, as Ali said. And remember that although I'm a doctor, I'm not your doctor. Medical issues we talk about are for your interest and information only, and they're not medical advice. Please consult your medical professionals for actual medical advice. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.
See you next time.